is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. Honeybees are so cool. A honeybee worker lives for just 5 or 6 weeks during the summer, but in that time she'll fly about 500 miles, visiting 20,000 individual flowers. She'll fly until her wings literally start to fail and fall off, and by the end of her life she'll have made about 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. A honeybee colony contains about 60,000 bees at any one time, and the vast majority of them are workers, which is how those twelfths of a teaspoon start to add up quickly. There's only one queen, though, and she lives quite a life. A queen bee lives for about 5 years, and she spends pretty much the entire time making new bees. She'll give birth to about 1 million bees during her lifetime, and during the summer, she'll give birth to a new bee about every 45 seconds. A hive will die without a queen, so when it's time for a succession, the bees feed a few larval bees a special nutrient-rich food called royal jelly. The first prospective queen to emerge from her cell promptly opens the other cells and kills her potential rivals, and then sets up a death match with her mom, who either fights or flies away. The males, there are only a few hundred in each colony, and their prospects for long-term happiness are somewhat grim. If they're lucky, they mate with a queen from another colony, though there's not much of an afterglow. They literally get ripped in half during the process and immediately die. If they aren't successful, their death comes a little bit later when they get evicted from the hive during the winter and freeze to death. Bees pollinate about 35% of the foods we eat in North America. When a bee finds a new spot to forage and returns to the hive, it will tell its companions how to find the new food by dancing and wiggling its little bee behind. This is called a waggle dance, and the exact sequence of shakes and turns convey exactly how the other bees can find the food site based on landmarks, its direction from the hive, and its orientation to the sun, all by shaking its butt and turning a few circles. There was an untended apple orchard at the center of the trailer park I lived in when I was little, and summers meant me and the other kids in the park would get stung by every flying insect imaginable. Honeybees, bumblebees, paper wasps, yellow jackets. If it has a stinger and lives in the Midwest, I probably experienced its wrath at some point before the age of 7. At the time, I took some comfort from the fact a honeybee would die after stinging me. Now I think bees are just about the coolest thing in nature, and my patio is lined with plants to appeal to honeybees and other pollinators. Join me today as we learn all about honey and how it gets used in our favorite adult indulgences. Our earliest record of bees comes from Patagonia about 100 million years ago. Bees were doing their waggle dance when there were still dinosaurs roaming the earth. Humans came along quite a bit later, but we were probably enjoying honey pretty quickly thereafter. And just like grain and fruit, it didn't take long for humans to discover honey could be fermented. Back in the fall, I had the chance to attend a virtual seminar for spirits writers and editors put on by the National Honey Board, an organization that represents the country's honey producers and promotes the use of honey in, well, anything honey can be used in. During the seminar, Keith Seitz and Alison Conklin talked about the history of honey fermentation, dating back to at least 7,000 years ago in Jiahu, China, though it was almost certainly being used earlier than that. Honey is full of fermentable sugar, but its low moisture content and pH keep it from spontaneously fermenting, which allows honey to stay stable pretty much indefinitely. Increase the moisture, however, and that changes. Honey plus water plus warmth and a little bit of time equals alcohol. This simplicity led to a range of beverages fermented with honey in antiquity, many of which have survived today. Mead is fermented entirely from honey, while braggot is basically a hybrid of beer and mead. In recent history, Belgian brewers have proven adept at brewing biere de miel, less a style than a group of beers that incorporate honey. And from there, modern craft brewers have started putting honey into more and more styles. I recently sat down with Alison and Keith to talk about the growing popularity of honey in both craft beer and bean-to-bar chocolate.
So my name is Allison Conklin, and I have been working with the National Honey Board for goodness, I think it's 6 years now, specifically working with the ingredient marketing program. So I help food and beverage manufacturers learn how to use honey in their products. Back in the good old days of travel, I would also handle all of our events. And also, I usually go through and help people find specifically what kind of honey varietal they want to use, whether they are looking for honey based on color or monofloral honeys, just to help them find the best fit for their end product.
I've been with the National Honey Board for going on 11 years now. Brought on originally to be a baking industry expert. That's where my background is. I was a journalist covering the wholesale baking industry. So I joined the Honey Board 11 years ago to try to increase honey usage in bakery foods. And over the last 11 years, we've slowly added on other markets and other markets. Big one is beer that was added on about 7 years ago and is really boomed for us. So I kind of do the same thing as Allison, although my focus is more on the technical side and talking about honeybees. So I always say I know more about honeybees than anybody who's never kept a bee in their life. It's something that I get it all from reading books and talking to beekeepers, but usually travel too much to have my own bees.
Why don't you share a little bit about what the National Honey Board does specifically to advance the use of honey in craft beer, and we'll also talk about craft chocolate as well.
You know, our mission as the National Honey Board, we don't sell honey. So people always say, okay, is this something you're trying to sell something? We don't. We represent the honey industry in the US. Whenever you think about the honey industry in the US, there's kind of two components to it. There's the large domestic producers, as well as the small backyard beekeepers, small beekeepers. We represent all of them, as well as honey that's imported from other countries into the United States. As long as it's 100% pure honey, nothing added to it, the ingredient has not been manipulated in any way, that's what we focus on. That's our main goal, is to promote that as an ingredient for use. With beer, it was something that we saw an opportunity 7 or 8 years ago, where we started noticing more and more brewers reaching out saying, hey, I want to brew a honey beer. What do you know about it? And we had no clue. We didn't know much. Nobody's really written the definitive guide on brewing with honey. So we took a chance and went and exhibited at the Craft Brewers Conference, and it was packed for us. It was a great show for us. We had a lot of questions, unfortunately, that we couldn't answer at that time, but it kind of clarified that this was something that craft brewers were interested in. So we invested in a lot of research. I took it upon myself to talk to brewers who were doing it, understand a little bit more, and then educate myself. And now we've got a fully functioning program where we're just trying to get more and more brewers to use honey, not necessarily just as something to make a sweet beer, because depending on where you add honey in, it could add no sweetness whatsoever. It could actually make it less sweet in the case of making a single IPA, a double IPA. So our goal at the National Honey Board with craft beer is kind of to just spread that knowledge base, whether it's bottle conditioning, whether it's hot side addition, cold side addition. What are the various ways honey can be used? And it's kind of the same thing with craft chocolate. You know, 10 years ago, whenever I started this, chocolate really wasn't a focus. You know, artisan chocolate was around, yes, but it wasn't as popular. And the big guys wanted nothing to do with honey because can be a bit of a pain because you're adding a liquid into a chocolate and it's really expensive. And people aren't, you know, asking for, hey, replace the sugar in my chocolate bar and my Snickers bar to honey. You know, they don't want to pay that extra 85 cents or whatever it's going to be. But now we've sort of seen that tides change where artisan chocolate is more popular. People are concerned about eating a chocolate product that is a cleaner ingredient label. We're seeing the same growth. So kind of what we do is try to foster that growth, give chocolatiers ideas, give brewers ideas, kind of inspire them by telling the story of the honeybee about what they can potentially be doing with this great ingredient.
In the last episode, we talked about maple sugar and syrup in beer and chocolate, and many of the same technical principles we discussed then apply to honey as well. On the beer side, anytime you're working with a fermentable sugar source, its impact on the alcohol strength, body, and sweetness of the finished beer will depend upon whether you add it before or after fermentation. Just like we discussed with maple syrup, honey is almost completely fermentable, so if you add it before fermentation, the sugar from the honey will ferment out. If honey is making up a portion of the fermentable base of the beer in this way, the resulting beer will actually be less sweet and lighter in body than if the corresponding amount of malt had been used to reach the same alcohol content, because the malt would have left behind proteins and unfermentable long-chain sugars as well. Only if the honey is added after fermentation will it increase the sweetness and body of the resulting beer. In the case of chocolate, adding a liquid to the chocolate making process will lead to seizing and clumping because chocolate has a high fat content from the cacao and doesn't tolerate water. Just like with maple, chocolate makers have to get creative when it comes to using honey. Keith and Allison, as well as Anna Sear from Ritual Chocolate, will talk more about this later on. One particularly exciting aspect of honey is that just like cacao origins, there are lots of different varieties of honey that all have different unique flavor and aroma profiles and mouthfeels. Most of us are used to honeys from a few widely available sources, like clover or wildflower, but there's a whole world of honey varietals out there. During the seminar I attended, Allison walked us through a tasting of honeys made by bees that had foraged from different botanical sources, from eucalyptus to sourwood trees to the more familiar orange blossom. Two that really caught my attention were buckwheat and meadow foam, which had flavors I had never encountered in honey before. I asked Allison to share a little more about honey varietals and what goes into appreciating honey with our senses.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This 5th issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bono Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half-pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers.
So with honey, the varietal of honey that you have is where bees are foraging for their nectar. So some of the most common ones you're going to hear is orange blossom honey or alfalfa honey. This is where the bees are going out and foraging for that nectar to bring back to their hive to then make into honey. And actually in the United States alone, there's over 300 different monofloral honeys. There's over 3,000 in the entire world. So it's all dependent where these bees are going, bringing it back, and making it into honey. And it can do all sorts of different applications, all sorts of different tastes, a lot more than what any supermarket could ever fit on their shelves. So you're definitely right. But even a honey that I'm going to be tasting from my hometown in St. Louis is going to taste vastly different than a honey that is from New York or California. So there's a lot more out there than just what you're used to with the traditional honey beer.
Sure. Can you share one or two maybe that you've tasted that are particularly unique?
Oh, definitely. That's a hard question just to name one or two. But two of them that definitely stick out. One is buckwheat honey. So buckwheat we grow a lot of it here in the United States, and it's an amazing flower for bees because it offers a lot of nectar for them to forage from. Actually, about an acre of buckwheat can yield about 150 pounds for bees to make of honey. But this honey if you see it, and if you've never seen a honey like this, you probably wouldn't even think it's honey because it's super, super dark. It almost looks like motor oil. So not that traditional amber colored honey that you're used to. And when you even pour it, it's very, very thick, very, very thick in viscosity. So from the looks to the texture to then the taste, even right away, if you open up buckwheat, you get an overwhelming smell of earthiness, horse blanket, these strange notes that you're not used to with a sweet honey. And that carries into the taste of it. Another one is meadow foam honey. And the meadow foam flower only grows in Willamette Valley, Oregon. So this is the only place that bees can go to forage for this nectar. And nothing is added to this honey, nothing at all. It's just the bees foraging from that flower, but it produces a taste like toasted marshmallow. Those are two honeys I love to sample with people. We usually bring those to in-person meetings or whether we're doing one of our virtual summits. And it really opens people's eyes to what different flavors are really out there for honey.
Yeah, and the event I participated in, I know you had us taste both of those, and the buckwheat was the one that stood out to me the most. I've been reading recently a little bit of information on monofloral honeys, some people suggesting that maybe this isn't great for the bees to have one primary foraging source. Can you share a little bit of information on that?
Yeah, it's something that if that's all they eat, yeah, it's not good. Bees are like us. It's not only the amount of nutrition we're getting, but it's the diversity of the nutrition. Bees are 100% responsible for pollinating almonds. And if you think about how popular almonds are now, you need a lot of bees. So you can get a lot of almond honey, a lot of monofloral honey from that, but there's not going to be a diverse food source. So that's why they move the hives in and then move the hives out. Generally, how things pollinate and how things bloom, you don't have to worry about sort of just monofloral honey because everything's only in season for a limited amount of time. And bees need food from spring to late fall. So they're going to be foraging. But in general, for the limited time they're exposed to that kind of thing, it's not that bad because, it's just kind of a huge food source. But they move around to other things just by the fact that those things go out of bloom, things like that. So it's not really that big of a concern. The bigger concern is places like where we live, where mainly corn and soy are grown, just because that's created a bee desert where there's no food whatsoever for bees, just because there's no nectar in those plants. And we've pretty much taken down all the land and planted nothing but those things. That's the bigger issue for honeybees.
Here in Ohio, that definitely rings true. It's just corn and soybeans as far as you can look.
Exactly. And it's, the amount of land that's been dedicated to those crops as well as cotton and things like that are a real struggle for bee, especially here in the Midwest, just because our bee numbers aren't that great anymore. It's great for feeding the world. The world needs all these corn and soybeans, but it's really bad for bees.
Can you briefly summarize some of the concern around colony collapse and the numbers that we're seeing with bees?
Yeah, definitely. And it is a massive concern because bees are responsible for, through their pollination efforts of about a third of the foods we consume. So about 35% of the foods we consume as Americans come from honeybees. That's everything from apples and avocados to broccoli, to celery, to almonds, things like that. So without honeybees, we lose a lot. Now, why honeybees are struggling, it is a massive topic that we could talk about for hours, but it's essentially 4 Ps. That's the big thing that is really hurting the bees. The first one is poor nutrition, just like we talked about. If you're a honeybee in the middle of central Ohio or central Illinois, you're really going to struggle because there's not a diverse food source around. So the poor nutrition is bad. The second P is pesticides. So whenever you do find nutrition that's good for you, there's a good chance that somebody sprayed it with a pesticide. That's not necessarily killing the bees outright, but sort of like if we're exposed to environmental toxins, our immune system gets weaker. We become more susceptible to things. So that's what's happening. Then bees have always had the final 2 Ps with our pathogens. So just like we get sick with the flu, with something like that. Bees are the exact same way. They can get a sickness inside of the hive. Since they have poor nutrition and a compromised immune system from the pesticides, they have a lot harder time fighting those pathogens. And then the last one is perhaps the most damaging, which is parasite. And the big one here in North America is the varroa mite. And it's this little mite that kind of attaches itself onto the back of a bee and really kind of acts as a portal, an entryway for all sorts of disease and bacteria and bad stuff to enter the bee, which the varroa mite, that parasite, is one thing that really can decimate a beehive. So unfortunately, there's not a silver bullet. If there was, I think it would be a lot easier for us to sort of reverse colony collapse disorder. It's those four things. The good news is that we're seeing numbers stabilize a little bit. And because honey's such a popular ingredient, there's more money in the honey industry now, in the bee industry now, and that money's being used to invest in more research, things like that. So there's a lot of research going on to figure it out, and solutions I feel will start slowly trickling out that's going to allow us to preserve those bees without losing track of them and losing a significant amount.
Allison, let's talk a little bit about the sensory side of things. I'm a certified Cicerone, so I have a particular way that I go about tasting a beer and evaluating it with all of my senses. And chocolate folks have the same thing for chocolate. Are there specific things that go into evaluating a honey and the smelling and tasting process that you employ?
It's a lot of similarities there because there are certified honey somms out there, sommeliers. So they go through the same process of where they can go through and be able to name all the way down to where this bee is foraging the nectar to then make this honey. So it's very similar. You were able to attend one of our virtual summits. If I would have had you in person, we actually would have tasted our honey in wine glasses, had it laid out and done all of that sensory experience there, where you would have looked at the color and the clarity of the honey. You would have then moved into smelling the honey, really getting those aromatics stirred up. You would even be taking the honey and moving it around in your own glass, all the way then to the tasting and the chewing of the honey to really get that mouthfeel and pick up on all those notes, whether it would be a fruity honey, a floral honey, an earthy honey, really pinpointing all of those notes, very similar to beer and chocolate.
We'll hear more from Keith and Allison in just a moment, but first we're going to talk to a brewer who makes one of the most highly regarded honey beers in the country. Rogue Brewing in Oregon is part of the craft beer Old Guard, opening all the way back in 1988. They're probably best known for their Dead Guy Ale. I just had one last week, actually. But they've been gaining attention in recent years for their Honey Kolsch. Kolsch is a beer style native to and named for the German city of Cologne. Its very simple malt bill is similar to that of pale German lagers like Pilsner or Munich Helles, but it's fermented with a special strain of ale yeast that ferments at the cooler temperatures lager yeast usually prefers. The result is a crisp, easily drinkable beer that offers subtle fermentation esters and a gentle hop aroma. In the case of Honey Kolsch, the beer gets an extra boost from the addition of wildflower honey. Honey Kolsch has won numerous awards from the Honey Beer Competition, an annual beer competition put on by the National Honey Board that recognizes the best beers in a variety of categories that utilize honey. Entries are currently open for this year's Honey Beer Competition, so check out the link in the show notes if your brewery has a beer to enter. Until recently, the folks at Rogue had their own farm on which they kept bees to produce honey for their beers, but COVID unfortunately forced them to phase that out. They're now working with a company that celebrates bees in all their glory. I talked with Danny Connors, Rogue's innovation brewer, about Honey Kolsch, their new honey provider, and Rogue's love of all things honey. So Danny, I understand you are the innovation brewer at Rogue. Why don't you explain for our listeners briefly what that entails?
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, my book on pairing craft beer and craft chocolate is available now on Amazon and on the Bean to Barstool shop. Pairing Beer and Chocolate, a guide to bringing the flavors of craft beer and craft chocolate together, is out now. This paperback book explains the process of pairing beer and chocolate, includes a guide to hosting a pairing at home, walks through dozens of beer styles to provide style-by-style pairing guidance, and gives room for taking your own pairing notes along the way. This is the only book on pairing beer and chocolate available. Grab your copy now at the link in the show notes or on Amazon. If you manage a tap room, bookstore, chocolate shop, or cafe and want to stock the book, get in touch about our easy wholesale process. Beer and chocolate belong together, and this book is your guide to getting the most out of every pairing.
We have our main production facility, which is in Newport, Oregon, and that's the big brewery. That's where pretty much any beer you've ever had on draft or out of a bottle or a can is being produced there. But I'm located in Portland. We have a smaller brew pub there on the east side of town, and it's just me in there. It's a smaller facility. I have a 1-barrel brew house and a 15-barrel brew house, and my job more or less is just to be working on the products that are going to be coming out next year or the year after that. We always have a lot of irons in the fire, as they say, but yeah, I'm looking toward the future in recipe development.
So you get to do the fun brewing.
Exactly, yes.
For a while, you guys had your own bees and then ended up getting rid of those. Can you give me like a brief overview of the background there?
Yeah, so we started farming in, must have been about 2010 or 2011. We were growing hops because there had been a bad hop shortage. Our original founder, Jack Joyce, had come from an agricultural town, so he always kind of wanted to be a farmer, and started growing everything we could. There's very few ingredients you can't grow that you can't put in beer, and honey just makes a lot of sense. It's tied into agriculture as well as the pollinators, so we started keeping bees. We made a mead a long time ago. We've made a few meads. We've made some braggots. And now most recently, we're making our honey kolsch with what was our honey. But now we're phasing out that farm. So we still have some of our own honey that we're using for it. But more and more we're relying on outside sources.
So I saw that you're working with Glory Bee. Tell me a little bit about them and that relationship.
Pretty much anybody I think on the West Coast that's working with honey needs to use them. We were producing our own honey, but there was still quite a bit of volume that we had to source from outside. It's just, especially the honey kolsch has done pretty well for us. So we weren't raising nearly enough honey to be covering a beer that we're putting in 6 packs and distributing nationally. So yeah, they're out of Eugene. You can buy more honey than you've ever seen in your life. I've bought 250-gallon totes of honey from them before. A lot of times we would work in drums or big buckets. But if you're gonna work in any sort of volume, Glory Bee is the way to go.
So looking at the honey kolsch, you mentioned that one has done really well for you. Talk to me a little bit about how that beer got developed and the idea behind it.
Yeah, so very often, especially with what we were doing on the farms, our new products were ingredient driven. So we would say, hey, we're growing hops. What can we do? Obviously, we're making some IPAs. Or we're raising bees, we got honey, let's make something with honey. Like I said, we had done a few other things. We did make Mead before, had green tea in it, but we kind of wanted to keep expanding the honey thing. Also working in honey and making meads is crazy expensive. So it helps if you can try and fold it into a beer a little bit. And the style is, I think, the perfect style to be using honey. It complements the flavor of it very well. It fills sort of a niche in our portfolio. It's a good warm weather beer, different than Pilsners. So I think it stands out a little bit. Yeah, I think we've been making it now for at least 6 years, maybe longer.
Looking at the malt bill on the website, it's a fairly complex malt bill for a kolsch. You've got, wheat and some Munich and things like that in there. What goes into building that malt bill around the honey that you're going to be adding?
I think there's finding a balance of trying to complement it a little bit. I think you can find a lot of crossovers in the flavors the honey is going to give you with the malt. So I think when you use malt that might be similar in flavor to the honey, it kind of boosts both of them up and kind of accentuates the flavor of both. You get a little bit of that with the Munich probably the most, but honey is also super delicate, so you can't go big. And that's why I think a beer like a kolsch is a really good style where you can still taste the honey. I don't know what you do to get flavor of honey into a double IPA or something like that. You really need to use something pretty delicate to still get that flavor.
And I assume you're adding this during the boil or soon after?
Soon after, we add it to the whirlpool, actually. That way it's getting heated up enough to be pasteurized, but you don't want to hit it too hot, and then it maintains still some of that delicate flavor that it has.
And are you using your house Pac-Man yeast, or is this a dedicated Kolsch yeast?
This is a dedicated Kolsch yeast.
And how much then of the fermentable base is that honey making up?
Oh man, I think it's probably less than 5%. It's not a whole lot, but yeah, I think the flavor does still come through quite well.
Is that kind of just a straight ahead honey flavor, or is there a particular substrate that the bees are foraging on that comes through, like a particular flower source or anything?
We're using a wildflower honey. It is what we're sourcing from Glory Bee. And my understanding of it is, when they say wildflower, it's just kind of a catch-all of everything that's out there. I think on that scale, you're pretty much always going to be working with the wildflower. And I think that's kind of it's also the flavor that most people are familiar with. When people think honey, they're thinking probably the flavor wildflower honey. So if you're going to put the name honey on it, you kind of want it to taste somewhat like what people think honey tastes like. So I think the wildflower is the way to go, even though you're kind of more or less forced to use wildflower honey anyway.
If you were to do something small batch on your 1-barrel system, have you thought about using any of the more exotic honeys for something?
Yeah, they're so amazing. So my facility, for a while, we did try and run a meadery out of it. And I did a lot of testing with just some of the single varietals, raspberry, clover, blueberry, things like that. And they're incredible. If you make a simple mead with them, the flavors are pretty amazing. But yeah, I would probably stick really in that realm, lighter beers, maybe some pale ales, maybe a very light IPA, something like in the session realm. And you could find maybe honeys, if you could find a hop profile that, went along with a raspberry honey or a blueberry honey. Mosaics, I think, have a lot of blueberry flavor to them. So there's something in there maybe. But again, you're using this amazing product in honey. That's also a very expensive product with honey. So you kind of want to get as much bang for your buck as you can.
A lot of casual craft beer drinkers hear something like honey and assume that a beer is going to be sweet. Obviously, you're fermenting that sugar out. Can you describe for somebody how they're going to perceive that honey in the beer, what the flavor profile is going to be?
Yeah. So with the wildflower, it is a pretty floral thing. And I think it complements a lot the hops we're using. They're kind of a noble hop profile. So there's a lot of the similar kind of herbal floral notes in there as well. And I'm a big believer in the idea that people perceive sweetness a lot of times when they have actually flavors. You don't smell sweet, but if they're tasting and smelling things that are familiar to them, that are from the profile of honey, from the profile of fruit or something like that, they say, oh, this smells sweet, this taste, so I think a lot of times people still will perceive that sweetness because of all the other flavor and aroma components that are in there from the honey.
What's the perfect moment for this beer? When are you personally going to reach for a honey Kolsch?
Right about now, right in the springtime, and pretty much all through the summer. When I'm picking beers to drink, I'm mostly drinking pale lagers, pilsners, things like that. It is a nice alternative. It's not going to be as bitter or as hoppy as most of those pilsners. So it's maybe a little bit of an in-between, maybe more of a springtime beer than like middle of the hottest summer beer, because it still has a little bit of sweetness. And the Kolsch yeast has, I think, a really amazing profile. The fruitiness that it kicks off is such a unique thing. So it's kind of that in-between beer.
What story is honey Kolsch telling?
It's telling the story of the bees. We were farmers, and Oregon and the Willamette Valley has this huge farm culture, and all along the gorge as well, and we more and more hearing the narrative about how important bees are for pollinating and keeping these things going, not just in the agricultural industry, but in the natural world around us. So I think it's a important story to tell, is the story of the pollinators.
What Danny mentioned about perceiving sweetness from aroma is worth talking about for a moment for both beer and chocolate tasters. Most of what we perceive as flavor comes from our sense of smell. Our sense of taste picks up only a few basic tastes: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami, or savory, and research is being done on whether there might be a few more, such as fat. We detect these tastes with our taste buds in our mouth and throat. Everything else that makes up flavor, it comes from our sense of smell. When a food or drink enters our mouths, our taste buds pick up those basic tastes, and the volatile aroma compounds in the food travel through our retronasal passageways in the back of our throats up to our olfactory bulb where we detect smell. Our brain combines these inputs of taste and smell, as well as textural input from our sense of touch, to create our unified perception of flavor. Because we don't like things to be more complicated than they have to be, our brains basically trick us into believing that it's all coming from our taste buds. A similar trick happens when we smell something orthonasally through our nostrils without tasting it on our tongues. Our sense of smell cannot detect basic tastes, sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. But you probably smelled something before and thought, that smells sweet, or that smells sour. Our brains learn and identify sensory inputs, including smells, much the same way they learn to recognize faces, more or less automatically through pattern recognition. In order to make sense of the mess of information in our brains, they find shortcuts to help us out. That means learning to associate sensory inputs that are normally found together. When you smell something that smells sweet, you're not smelling sweetness itself. You're smelling an aroma that your brain has learned to associate with the presence of sugar. Fruit, maple syrup, desserts, and yes, honey are all great examples. We smell the aromatic compounds released by these foods. Our brains remember them pretty much always being accompanied by sugar, and so they tell us sweet, even though that's not something we can actually smell. A great illustration of this is found in vanilla and cinnamon, two spices that are normally used in desserts here in North America. Neither spice is sweet at all, but when we smell something in which one or both of these spices are dominant aromas, we are conditioned to perceive them as sweet because we're used to tasting them in desserts. In many other global cuisines, however, these spices are commonly found in savory or even spicy dishes. This matters when tasting beer or chocolate because aromatic compounds that signal sweetness to our brains might not be accompanied by a corresponding level of residual sugar in either of these treats. Many hops give off tropical fruit aromas, so beers that feature these will smell sweet because we're used to associating these aromas with the presence of fructose. In this case, though, these aromas are coming from hop essential oils, and the beer might actually be quite dry on the tongue. Chocolate is already something we've been conditioned to associate with sweetness from childhood candy, so evaluating how sweet a bean-to-bar chocolate actually is can be tricky. In both cases, tasters have to train themselves to pay attention to the actual sweetness level of the beer or chocolate, rather than what their sense of smell is helpfully trying to shortcut for them. One way to do this is to pinch your nose shut before tasting a beer or piece of chocolate for the first time. Your sense of smell will be muted, and you'll only get information from your taste buds. Once you've done this for a few seconds to determine the sweetness level, you can release your nose and get a flood of aromatic information. This is especially relevant when working with something like honey. If a good amount of honey is added to a beer before fermentation, the sugar will be fermented out, but the aromatic properties of the honey will most likely remain. When a drinker smells and tastes the beer, they might perceive it as sweeter because their brain is smelling honey and remembering that's always sweet. Our brains and our sensory systems are really cool, and much of the practice of becoming a skilled taster is about teaching our brains to stop doing the convenient behind-the-scenes shortcutting they're supposed to do. I talked with Keith and Allison about trends they're seeing in honey usage in both beer and chocolate, and they pointed toward a proliferation of creative uses for this sweet ingredient. What are some trends that either of you have seen as far as the use of honey in beer and chocolate? Have you seen that change over the last few years in the way it's being used?
Yeah, we've definitely seen it change in beer. You know, it used to be just hot side addition because you could control it. People concerned naturally about the microorganisms, the bacteria, the wild yeast in beer. So the solution was dump it in the boil. It'll scorch off all that stuff, and then you don't have to worry about it. And that's definitely a legitimate usage. It's going to dry out your beer. It's going to raise the ABV a little bit, which can be a very desirable result depending on what type of beer you're drinking. Now we're seeing a big shift to cold side addition, mainly after primary fermentation, as well as I think what I'm most excited about is bottle conditioning. There's a few great brewers out there like Celador Ales, as well as Sideways Farm and Brewery, that all their beers they bottle condition with honey. It gives a kind of a tighter foam, almost like a nitro without the nitro, a creaminess to it. And again, it's not for everybody. If you're just creating a massive, large produced lager, I don't know how much more dynamic you need in that beer. It is what it is. But if you are producing something that's kind of a little more unique, it does add an interesting dynamic. We're not only seeing sort of where it's being used, but also the beer style. It used to be, you had your honey browns, your products like that, and then you also had your blonde ales that were sweetened with honey. Those are still two big categories, but we're seeing massive growth in IPAs. And in the 6 years we've been doing our honey beer competition, IPAs is now, I believe, like our third largest category. So we're seeing a lot of honey in IPAs. Allison's favorite, sours, a lot of honey and sours, as well as stouts, and really across the board. So not only in usage, but in category style, chocolate side, it's all about that natural sweetener. Healthful indulgence is what we call it. If I'm eating a chocolate bar, that's an indulgent product, but I also want some health attributes from it, some clean label attributes, and that's where an ingredient like honey can come in, is really satisfy not only the angle of creating an indulgent, luxurious chocolate, but also making you feel really good whenever you eat it, because it's not loaded up with an unnatural sweetener or something that's been heavily kind of manufactured.
Allison, Keith mentioned that you really like sour beers and that we're seeing more honey use in there. Do you want to share a little bit of what you're seeing as far as how sour brewers are working with honey?
When I first came onto the honey board team, I really started working with breweries right away. And it started off that breweries were coming up to us and they're like, "Oh, you're here to talk about mead." And it's like, no, there's a lot more to using honey in brewing than just mead. So then they would say, "Well, then you're here to talk about braggots." And it's like, no, you can use it in more things than just braggots. So yeah, as Keith mentioned with this honey beer competition, when we first started, our very, very first competition had 20 entries. And then the next year it had 60 entries. And each year it has almost doubled every single year. Our largest competition in 2019, we had over 290 entries in our honey beer competition. And at first, when we started, we didn't have a sours category because we just didn't see it there. So over these last 6 years that I've been with the team, it's just the overall acceptance of it. So yeah, it's just that innovation just keeps growing and growing there.
I think a couple flagship brewers, if you look at Cascade out in Portland, Oregon, they've been big supporters of our initiatives, and they started, testing out sours or honey in their sours, and especially focusing on varietals, and found some really dynamic things happening. And we just wrapped up a research project looking at what those things are with them. But having a brewery like that that's so synonymous with honey and sours really kind of helps inspire other brewers. So I think that's been a big part of it. Whenever you get some big brewers taking a chance on it, or at least some influential brewers, then it kind of trickles down to everybody else.
On the chocolate side, you brought up the concern that you're using a liquid, which is obviously very, very difficult to use in the chocolate making process because it may seize up. So how are you seeing chocolate makers actually work with the honey in chocolate production?
Yeah, it's challenging, but it's definitely not impossible. The good thing that honey has going for it is that it's a liquid, yes, but it's made of mostly dissolved solids. So just that by itself really kind of helps out the process. It also is thicker. That viscosity is going to kind of interfere and create surface tension that it's not going to be as big of an issue. The real key is how much you add. If you wanted to add a boatload of honey to a chocolate, it's not going to go well. It's something that you have to start small and then slowly scale up as you kind of get a little more comfortable with it. And you also have to kind of level set your expectations. If you're looking for a perfectly tempered chocolate with the perfect snap, it's going to be difficult to get that out of any kind of liquid-based sweetener. Now, that's not to say you're not going to get a snap and you're not going to get a temper, but it's not going to be as perfect as if you were using a dry sweetener or something like that in the chocolate. So what we always tell the confectioners we work with is start small and then slowly kind of get it to where you want it. It can add a lot of dynamic flavors, especially whenever you talk about the varietals you use, but it's not something that you can add a whole, like you said, add a whole mess of it to it, because that 17.1% moisture content in honey will interfere with it after a while.
Well, craft beer for the time being is a much larger industry, of course, than bean to bar chocolate is. And on the beer side, you've got the competition, you've got the Honey Beer Summit. What are some specific initiatives on the chocolate side that you're doing to promote the use of honey?
Yeah, we said earlier, confectionery has never been a huge category for us, just because nobody had any problem with a bunch of sugar in their products. Now that that's changing, like you said, the bean to bar movement is making people think twice about their ingredients, and that's why it makes so much sense. Is because people are so concerned with where their chocolate beans are coming from, the farm, the sustainable sourcing of it. And it's kind of the same thing with honeybees. If you're telling a story of that farmer who's bringing you the bean, but then putting in some sort of sweetener or some sort of other ingredient that's highly manufactured or processed without the story, what's kind of the point? So we're seeing a lot more interest in helping tell that story. So what we're focused on the chocolate side is kind of telling that parallel story, the story of the beekeeper, whether it's here in the United States or say over in a country like India or South America. You can kind of tell that similar story. And that's what our efforts are focusing on now, is really promoting the story of chocolate bean to bar in the same way that you can tell that same parallel story of the honey from the bee to the bar. So it's you lose a letter and you get bean to bar and bee to bar. So it's kind of makes perfect sense.
Nice.
But we're not doing any chocolate competitions yet. The market isn't that great. Hopefully we can soon, because I would love to do a chocolate competition.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Be pretty fun.
So because you love the sensory process with honey so much, and you're clearly passionate about the different flavors and even the colors and things like that, is there any loss in then tasting it in another product where that honey character is going to be somewhat diminished on its own? You're not getting the honey by itself?
I don't think that there's a loss. I think it's a gain, because I think that you can really accentuate those flavors that are in the honey. It can add that mouthfeel. It can add a color to your product. It can do so much. Going back to the buckwheat honey, I love honey, but it's one that if you put it in front of me, it's not one that I want to taste. I'm not into earthiness or funkiness. But if you put it in a beer, I just can taste those notes and really appreciate how it elevates that beer. Same thing if you're going into even baking with buckwheat. You can do a blind taste testing of granolas made with different honey varietals in front of me, and I pick the buckwheat every single time. So I think that when you are selecting honey for any kind of product that you're making, you really should do your own sensory analysis there and do your own honey tasting, because those different honeys can do such amazing things for your end products.
When it's being added to beer, where now you've got the fermentation process being brought into this, especially if the honey is being added pre-fermentation, do you still get that unique character, or is it lost somewhat during fermentation?
So there you do got me.
Yeah.
You added earlier, yes, then there you would be losing some of those qualities of the honey. It's all about where you're adding it in the brewing process. However, if you are brewing with honey earlier in the brewing process, some honeys, especially like alfalfa, it can add really fantastic aromatics to your beer. So that really comes down to what you're trying to accomplish with honey in that product. So yes, you could lose some of the taste there, but if you use it in later on in the brewing process, those notes can only be accentuated from there.
I think the Belgians really mastered kind of not losing things in their beer to meals. They would use honey in two different phases. So they would just get a general honey, kind of like a wildflower that didn't have a specific kind of really overwhelming flavor note, and they'd add that on the hot side. And then after primary fermentation, they'd find a monofloral variety that had strong flavor notes that they wanted to do and add that on the cold side. So they got the functional benefits and some of the aromatics from the hot side, but then really that kind of unique flavor profile on the cold side. So that multi-stage addition, we're seeing a lot more of that, just as I think we see, different styles. A lot of Belgian styles use honey. And I think a lot of people kind of look for inspiration for how they handle their honey usage, which is really in multiple places.
I've interviewed one of the brewers from Rogue about their honey Kolsch, which has done quite well in the beer competition. Are either of you able to share any thoughts on that beer?
I will. It's my desert island beer. I have to imagine I've tasted more honey beers than any person in the world.
Sure.
And Allison's probably a close second. And by God, that one just keeps coming back, and it seems to keep getting better. It's really crazy. They won our competition in year 1 whenever we had 20 entries, in year 2 whenever we had 60 entries, and then they came back and won it again last year. And they continually place high. It's just, in my opinion, it's the perfect execution of a honey beer per style. So you can tell that you're drinking a Kolsch. The honey doesn't overwhelm. You're still getting that crispness that you want from a Kolsch, something you want to be drinking on a hot day. But the honey just adds these really unbelievable aromatics to it, as well as just the subtlest hint of sweetness, very, very subtle. And no, it's something that is definitely one of my favorite honey beers out there.
Yeah. And it's interesting with all of the other styles you've been talking about, more complex styles. That's such a relatively simple, straightforward beer style, and it's just so good.
Isn't that the way of the beer industry now, though?
Right.
I know in my personal life, I've consumed more lagers and straight traditional German beers in the last, I feel, year. Sort of how the food industry is going to more comfort food.
Mm-hmm.
The beer industry during the pandemic had me screaming for straight up lagers.
Another comfort folks have been reaching for during COVID is good chocolate. One of my favorite bean-to-bar chocolate makers is Ritual Chocolate in Utah. They're well known and loved for their single origin bars, as well as a thoughtful line of inclusion bars that celebrate the flavors and culture of their corner of the Southwest. If you follow Bean to Barstool on Instagram, and you should, you've probably seen me use a few of their bars, like Pine Nut or Après, in beer pairings. Everyone seems to have their own favorite Ritual bar. I've been to Utah only once, over 20 years ago when we visited when I was a teenager. My dad and I hiked the Narrows of Zion Canyon, and in the evenings I would swing on a rope swing into a creek behind the hotel. The haunting, almost alien landscapes of this state have stayed with me. Utah is known as the Beehive State. When the Mormon pioneers settled in the state, they called it the State of Deseret, from a word in the Book of Mormon meaning honeybee. Honeybees aren't any more prominent in the state than anywhere else, from what I can tell, but the Beehive State nickname stuck, and Anna Sear of Ritual wanted to make a bar that celebrated the beauty of honey in Utah.
Yeah, so I am Anna Sear, and I'm one of the co-founders and co-owners at Ritual Chocolate. Yeah, we've had our business for over 10 years now, and so I do a little bit of everything depending on the day. A lot of business development, of course, and working on sales and marketing, but also helping with product development and production, and just kind of overseeing everything. So
Ritual was fairly early in the bean to bar movement, right?
It was. It's so funny to think back and how much the industry has changed for craft chocolate. When we sort of had the idea in about 2008, there was just a handful of chocolate makers, maybe 20, 25. And now there's like probably over 500. So it's really exploded. So which is exciting.
And where did the name Ritual come from?
Yeah, it's funny. Ritual was one of the first names that came up, and then we went through about 1,000 different names and then landed back on Ritual, as always happened. But we liked the sound of it, and I think it is also for us a callback to the history of cacao and how, you know, it used to be so revered and respected, and it was used in the rituals and ceremonies of the Mayans and Aztecs. And that's really been lost through the years. And now it's, you know, so much more of a commodity product, and just it's been a bit of a race to the bottom of price and quality. So we're really trying to bring back that chocolate is something to be, you know, respected, and it's so much that goes on even before we get the beans, just on the farm side to get good beans, and then the chocolate making process is so involved that it takes a lot to make a good chocolate bar. So
And how are you primarily sourcing? Are you working directly with farms or with Uncommon Cacao or a mix?
Yeah, so we work with Uncommon, which actually we work with them for a honeycomb toffee bar, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. But we tend to work with different brokers like Uncommon. We work direct with Marignon Chocolate and Meridian Cacao. So it's sort of each origin that we work with, it's sort of come about in a different way through the years.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about the honeycomb toffee bar then. So that's a 75% Belize bar. What made you go with that particular origin for these flavors?
It's funny that I've wanted to make this bar for years because I'm from England, and I loved the crunchy bars. I don't know if you've ever had those. That's just like
I don't think so.
It's kind of like it's thick honeycomb toffee, and then it's coated in chocolate, and it's definitely like a candy bar. But I loved the honeycomb toffee, and so I knew that I wanted to make a bar firstly with honeycomb toffee, and then we played around with the recipe for that toffee, and then just tried our different origins with it. And the Belize, just the flavors worked so well. The honeycomb coffee is quite sort of sweet and sticky, and then the Belize has a very sort of rich dark chocolate base to it, so it's very balanced. I would say it's the most balanced of our single origins. It has some kind of like nice sort of lighter fruity notes as well, but they just really I think both together, the Belize really made the honey flavor pop, and you could really kind of, you know, get some of the nice flavors from the Belize as well.
So you mentioned this a little bit with the fact that you're using honeycomb toffee. I wanted to ask you about the process for including honey, because obviously introducing a liquid can be a bit of an issue. So how is it that you're actually using the honey to get that into the bar?
I wanted to include honey, but I didn't quite know how initially. So landing on the honeycomb toffee was a great way that we could sprinkle it on top of the chocolate, because we couldn't actually, I know that some people do, but we've tried working with honey and agave instead of sugar. The machines that we use, a lot of them have a granite composite base with our melangers and our conch, so it'll actually rip the stone out if it's too sticky in the chocolate. So we tried it early on, and we were like, okay, maybe not do that. So we actually add it right at the end when we're tempering and molding the bars. We sprinkle it onto the back of the bar. And so it's nice because then you get the texture of the honeycomb, and you can see it on the back of the bar.
So you say on the website that Utah is the beehive state, which I was totally unaware of. Is this a bigger part of Utah culture than I was aware of?
Yeah, so there are a lot of honey producers here. It is considered the beehive state. I feel like someone actually told me recently that it wasn't because of the honey industry here. It was for another reason, and I can't actually remember what that reason was, but I think now it's just kind of stuck, and there are a lot of honey producers here, and you know, that make really good quality honey. So I mean, that also just inspired us. We're surrounded by these amazing producers, so we wanted to find a way to incorporate it. We developed our mountain line, I guess it was about 2-3 years ago now. Before that, we'd really focused on single origin, and then we did a couple of house blends with our origin. But yeah, we wanted to incorporate some more flavors, and you know, we're very inspired by the mountains here around us, and I feel like there's a lot of unique flavors you can pull. Honey, of course, was one. Another one is our pine nut bar, so you can actually forage for pine nuts here. And so we grind the pine nuts finely into the chocolate. So it has a really lovely pine nutty flavor, of course, but then it's very smooth and soft, almost like a milk chocolate, which is nice. Another one of the bars is lavender juniper. I've wanted to incorporate juniper for a long time because it kind of has that piney sort of mountain tree flavor, but it's a difficult berry to work with because it's such a pungent flavor. We kind of, when we were testing that bar, we were like having to keep scaling back on the juniper, and then we wanted to find another local flavor that we could kind of balance with, and we actually settled on lavender, which seems unusual because it's also another strong flavor, but it works really well with the juniper because it's quite sort of aromatic. And so we work with a local lavender farm here, a Lavender Hill farm, to source the lavender. So that's a great bar. The other two bars in our mountain line, they're more sort of concept bars. So we have our s'mores bar, which is kind of our camping bar, where we sprinkle in graham crackers and then crystallize the sugar in the chocolate to give the kind of burnt marshmallow flavor, which is fun. And then we have our newest bar, which is our après bar, and that sort of ties into the ski culture here with having a bit of après after being on the mountains. So it's the nibs are soaked in sparkling wine, and then we top it with some dried raspberries. So it's just got a really sort of fun pop to it.
And that one had been a limited release at one point, and then popular demand brought it back, right?
Yeah, we used to call it the berries and bubbly bar, but people loved it, and they were upset when we ran out. So we were like, well, maybe we should just make this a thing.
So on the honeycomb toffee bar, you work with Hollow Tree Honey. Can you tell me a little bit about them and how that relationship developed?
Yeah, so they are fantastic. I've actually have been buying their honey for years. They're a local company, and all their hives are in the Wasatch Range. Well, most of the honey producers here source pretty locally, but they kind of take it to the next level and keep it to the Wasatch Range. And they actually have a lot of hives in the Park City area. And so we source what's called the mountain wildflower honey. It's got a very kind of light aromatic flavor. And I just really liked their philosophy, and that they keep it really simple. They cold press their honey. So it's raw, but they take the extra step of cold pressing, so they don't even heat the honey when they bottle. So that just ensures that you're keeping all the kind of good bacteria and microbes in there. And they also coarse filter, so they're not filtering, they're essentially just filtering out the wax and not filtering out any of the pollen or other good stuff. So it's really pure, and I think that's so much better for flavor, and then also just health benefit.
Do those processes change the texture from what people would be used to in honey?
Yeah, it does. And so they're very clear that they're like, the honey is very solid to work with. So we're always trying to get them to give us sort of the youngest honey, because the longer it sits, the more solid it is. And so it's a bit tougher for us to make the honeycomb toffee, but it's worth the extra effort because I think it has a fantastic flavor. And then what I also love about them is they're really trying to kind of promote saving the bees and helping the bee habitat. So you can purchase wildflower seeds that you can sow in your garden for good pollinators. And they also have hives you can set up around your garden just to help give a home to native bees.
So with the wildflower, then, are they doing any kind of monofloral honeys, or is it all just open foraging?
It's open, open foraging. So I think they really just let the bees, do what they want, and it's kind of interesting. I was reading about it that bees don't like to travel very far. So what's interesting is they can have two hives next to each other, and you have the bees on one side. They'll be gravitating towards all the flowers on one side closest to them, and then you have the other hive, the bees in the other hive, going after the flowery bush next to them. So you'll get these differences in flavors from the different pollen, even though the hives are right next to each other. So I thought that was interesting.
How does that flavor come through directly then in the bar? Is it sort of a straight ahead honey flavor, or is there something particular that you're able to pick out from this honey that makes it through?
Yeah, I would really say for this honey in particular, the flavor is just a little bit more florally aromatic. And it's very subtle, but yeah, there's just a little bit more of a kind of, I don't know if you call it sort of a bouquet on the nose kind of aromatic quality to it, which I think is really nice. And I always feel like is a nice complement to chocolate, because you're kind of getting that full range of flavor. So from the richness of the chocolate all the way to those kind of light aromatic notes.
I often find that different chocolates are right for different moments and different occasions. Do you find yourself reaching for this bar in particular moments?
It's definitely been a popular one. And I think it's so nice because, we're obviously all about the dark chocolate, but it has that kind of sweet crunchiness to it. And so I think for a lot of people that don't always like an uber dark chocolate and want more of like a sweet treat, it's really nice because it has the sweetness there, but it's not overly sweet because the base chocolate is still 75% cacao. But I will give this one a lot as a gift because I feel like it's you can't go wrong. I actually did, I was messing around with cheese pairings recently, and it works really well with a lot of cheeses. There's some soft goat cheeses, and
I bet.
I paired it with a fontina, and that was fantastic. So
yeah,
recommend
especially, I mean, you drizzle some honey over goat cheese or something like that. That can work on its own. So I can imagine that would work really well. Your packages do often include recommended beverage pairings, wine and beer. What are your recommended pairings for this bar?
I would say, I feel like I would do more of a beer for this, even like a kind of Belgian blonde. So something that's a bit more mid-range, lighter for summer. I think that would go really well for the honey. And then I would say for on the non-alcoholic side, a jasmine tea would be fantastic.
What story is Honeycomb Toffee telling?
It took a long time to develop, and really what we want to say with it is, it has a wonderful balanced flavor, but it really ties into our locale here and also just protecting the ecosystem. It's really kind of a gentle reminder to people to think about, protecting the bees and supporting other local makers. So.
The beautiful story of honey really is inseparable from our relationship to honeybees, these amazing little insects that communicate through dance and fly till their bodies fail just to make a couple drops of honey. Alison Conklin explains this story best.
I think that it's really telling the beauty of Mother Nature. We like to say that honey is really Mother Nature's sweetener. I wish I could just go on and on about the story of just how the bee goes and forages for the nectar, the relationship that it has with flowers, and its ability to pollinate and help other flowers, yet still helping its own family of hive. To then the process of all the worker bees coming together and for a common cause to make this honey, and then the relationship that it has with the beekeepers to then be bottled. These little itty bitty insects can do so much in their lifetime to make such a wonderful end product, a selfless end product for us to enjoy.
You can learn more about Alison Conklin and Keith Seitz and their work at the National Honey Board, Danny Connors and Rogue Brewing, and Anna Sear and Ritual Chocolate in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.